Good afternoon. Welcome to our program today on battling disinformation with realistic solutions in a modern society. This afternoon we have Ken Jensen and Walter Olsen. I'll introduce Ken. He's a senior research associate at FPRI in Philadelphia. And in that capacity, he's pursuing a project that is seeking to identify and prioritize issues of national security and related tech and cyber issues. Ken was a founding member and officer in corporation and first research director of the U.S. Institute of Peace. He's been a long time I've had a long time affiliation with FPRI. And I realize I forgot to introduce who I am. I'm Raleigh Flynn. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the president of FPRI since January. FPRI is a 501c3 nonprofit. We provide expert analysis and research with a view to educating policymakers, policy influencers, and the general public. If you haven't heard of FPRI before, I encourage you to go to our website and consider becoming a member and sponsoring us. And before I turn it over to Ken, I'd also like to thank you for those of you who are supporters. We could not do these programs without you. We also are posting all these videos on the FPRI YouTube channel so that if you miss something or you want to listen to it again, and I confess I've listened to some of these more than one time, please tune in there. So without, the housekeeping. The housekeeping at the bottom of your screen, there's a chat box. If you click on that chat box, on the right hand of your screen will be a pop-up window, and in that window you can write your questions. So we will have about midway through the program or thereabouts a question and answer session. So please go along throughout the discussion and ask your questions. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Ken Jensen.
Thank you, Raleigh. I guess I'm on, right? Others can hear me fine. Good. All right. I won't go over the stuff that I have on the larger project that was begun last December and vilely interrupted by pandemic. But I will say that what we've managed to do is to get sets of issues put forward after deliberations as to what the most significant questions or the questions that reign in cybersecurity are the most important really for us to look at. In December, we dealt with the threat of quantum computing, how the government and the private sector can effectively protect the U.S. economy from cyber interference. Counterintelligence in meeting national security threats, cyber attacks among them, and resolving the commercial encryption and law enforcement problem. Today we turn to the problem of disinformation. Originally, I used the term content moderation to describe what we were interested in. A euphemism, if there ever was one. But my thinking about this was that content moderation in social media these days has turned into a muddle, with many of our pundits inclined to believe that some censorship must surely be in order. By and large, the matter has come to be an interminable discussion of what speech is good enough to be protected and bad enough to be censored. This without closure on the free speech issue and to how propaganda and disinformation can be effectively dealt with by means other than censorship. This virtual event proposes to suggest ways out of the muddle. With that, I'll introduce my colleague, Walter Olsen. He's a senior fellow at Cato Institute's Robert A. Levy Center for Constitutional Studies, and a most prolific writer on constitutional law topics. Walter, proceed.
Thank you, Ken. Well, we have a big subject here in disinformation, and I want to start by recalling what may be the most famous and popular cartoon ever about the internet, the one in which someone is sitting up late at their screen and says, "I can't go to bed. This is important. Someone is wrong on the internet." And we all laugh, especially probably the longer we've been on the internet, the more we laugh, because we recognize that there is just too much wrong on the internet to make it a project. And yet here we are this afternoon talking about the project of making the internet less wrong. We have to narrow it down. We have only an hour. So I will narrow it down in a moment, but I want to update that cartoon a little bit, because when it came out, it seemed that arguing back against the person who was wrong on the internet was the main way of dealing with the prevalence of wrongness. And now, of course, we realize that it's much faster and more efficient to report their post and try to get them banned, or to lobby Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, or whatever the medium is where you saw them be wrong, to change their policies so that no one will be allowed to be wrong. Or, as we are quickly getting to, approach the government of the United States or Germany or some other to get them to issue orders that these posts must be moderated off so that someone will stop being wrong on the internet. Well, we will get to all of these different approaches, and perhaps one additional one, which is the so-called civic education approach of teaching people not to be so gullible about memes and other ways in which the internet fools them. But I want to get back to the question first of what it means to be wrong on the internet. And we can separate it into giving offense, controversial opinion, being factually wrong, and then how to be factually wrong. And everyone begins this topic by thinking that they must be against moderating off things that are merely controversial or perhaps merely offensive, because that's too subjective, isn't it? And so I think the first lesson here is that no, in fact, there are lots of forums that moderate off controversy as such, and that's fine. If you are moderating a Facebook page on your family reunion, you might moderate off all controversy, and that's fine for that purpose. So moderation depends on what people are using the forum for. There is no single best standard, because some places are really better off without controversy, offense, or anything of that sort. As soon as you get to misinformation, you get to the widely drawn distinction between misinformation and disinformation. And notice that our title today has us focusing in on disinformation. And the conventional distinction is that misinformation is not intentionally wrong, it just happens to be wrong. Disinformation is someone being wrong on purpose, wrong by design, wrong because they want to fool you. And an awful lot of us will be nodding at this point saying, yes, it's disinformation. That's what we want to get off the internet. And it's not too much to ask the various social platforms to at least get rid of that. So let's stop there and say, how easy is it to distinguish deliberate falsehood from perfectly sincere inadvertent falsehood in order to get the former off? And the answer is, it's super difficult. Social scientists talk about the difficulty of doing this through surveys, or I think of it as someone who spends a lot of time in law with reference to the concept of perjury. Perjury is really important in the legal system. The courts rely on the assumption that people are not deliberately lying. The whole legitimacy of the system collapses if perjury becomes okay. So you would expect that, therefore, one of the chief orders of business for our courts would be to identify and punish perjury, and there'd be a lot of people in prison for it. No, almost no one is in prison for perjury, and it's almost never prosecuted. And the reason, there are several reasons, but one of the most important is simply that it's so darn difficult to prove, especially not until much, much later, that misinformation was deliberate. Finding out whether it was deliberate misinformation or not is an extraordinarily difficult task, even for a system that has tremendous incentives, very expert people operating it. And it is much harder, of course, when you are talking about 25-year-old employees of Twitter or Facebook in the San Francisco Bay Area. So I think we need to start by recoiling from the idea that we can necessarily tell misinformation from disinformation. And in fact, this explains, I think, some of why the major social media platforms have tended to go after disinformation only in an indirect and after the fact way. For example, there was just another announcement that Twitter had identified and removed a bunch of insincere accounts. I just love that phrase, insincere accounts, formed by the governments of China, Russia, and Turkey, I believe, were the three countries, in order to intervene in certain things. Well, they identified them well after the controversy. They were probably not doing all that much of interest to Americans, and they were not amplifying things in a very effective way because most of their posts didn't reach Americans. When they try to remedy misinformation, they immediately step into American politics. And we all remember a few weeks ago how Twitter, to me very innocuously, because as a First Amendment person, I'm always recommending more speech instead of less speech. And Twitter was doing a very modest step of more speech by saying, get the facts on. And it began to append that to a couple of presidential tweets. Even that, which might seem like the simplest way of approaching it, immediately landed Twitter in a firestorm. And indeed, I began to be a critic of Twitter myself on this, because one of the first two tweets they chose to add a get the facts tweet to was one in which the president had engaged in prediction and opinion. I didn't find his prediction or his opinion persuasive. It was about what would happen if we had vote by mail. I'm an advocate of vote by mail. I thought his prediction was out to lunch and his opinion was erroneous. But is that really what they're going to step in on for misinformation? So there was a debate about the debate, whether or not we can expect objectivity from and I'll just throw in one or two, because I know we want to get to a discussion with Ken and with all of you. Please be thinking of questions to put in chat, because that's how we find out what you'd like us to talk about. But on the question of whether erroneous assertions can be fact-checked, I think immediately of the great fact-checking ventures that have been started, like PolitiFact and Washington Post Fact Checker. And a lot of my political friends remember the times when they disagreed with these fact-checking services, and they get upset and they say, they've all got their own slant, they've all got their own opinion. That's not my view. I like almost all of the fact-checking services, even though I occasionally recognize their bias, even though I occasionally recognize they don't get it right. I like what they're trying to do. I like the people involved. But one of the most interesting studies anyone ever did was to measure what might be called the rate of concordance between fact-checking services. If someone said something controversial and they were fact-checked by each of the different major fact-checking services, did they all agree on getting 4 Pinocchios? Well, they couldn't agree among themselves. Some of them viewed it as only a minor error and that the person was mostly right. Others gave the equivalent of 4 Pinocchios. So this should make us all humble. Some of the most talented people assigned to the fact-checking task in political debate can't agree among themselves on some pretty major issues. And so we need to be realistic in what we expect of large organizations. When I talk to people at the various platforms, one of the themes that comes back again and again is that there is no method of platform moderation that does not leave some reasonable people unsatisfied. And in particular, even when you find the one that kind of works, it never scales when you multiply the number of users by 100. So they are keenly aware of these problems. They introduce a lot of new measures, and we'll talk about some of those by which information might be added. And I'll close on this before kicking it back to Ken. Twitter is experimenting with an idea which I just love, which is when someone retweets an article without bothering to click and open it, they're thinking of putting up a little prompt box saying, would you like to read what your link says before you retweet it? It's a perfect way of getting people to think. If they want to go ahead and retweet based on the headline, they still can. But at least they're being reminded that they're acting hastily. Now, Ken, what do you think of all that?
Well, if I'm back, am I back on or am I muted? I have to unmute, I guess.
You're on.
Ken, you're good. You're now muted, Ken.
Ken is still muted. I wonder if, Eli, can you unmute Ken? I see the mute symbol.
I am doing it right now.
Okay.
Okay, did that do it?
Sounds better. You're on, Ken.
Okay, thank you. I had expected Walter to be extremely subtle, and because he's the kind of analyst who moves deeply into things, and he's been thinking about this for a good deal longer than I have. I sort of perked up this morning when I read two things. One, a report that Joe Biden calls for fact-checking and removal of non-factual political ads, which I think takes us right back to the most basic issues that are involved here. And as I thought about it, I came across what Walter mentioned, that Twitter had removed 32,000 accounts. That's the news today. I mean, as he said, it happened a while ago. But the statistics are interesting, and if he says that this was not a significant intrusion on Twitter that Twitter dealt with, I would mention that 23,750 of these accounts were Chinese, and there was another 150,000 amplifier accounts or amplification accounts, which I don't understand, but all right. But there were only 1,152 from Russia, and but there were 7,340 from Turkey. So what I would ask Walter, why is this probably insignificant?
Well, first, I wouldn't say that it's always insignificant. And certainly, if you were trying to research a narrow topic that was of interest to one of these foreign powers, for example, if you were researching the Hong Kong unrest and you were following popular hashtags on Twitter, you might well run into some of those sock puppet Chinese accounts, and you would need to be aware of that in gauging whether what was the prevailing opinion, because the opinion being put forward was sometimes just fake amplification. Overall, though, people have been studying for a while how influential fake news is, whether it influences elections, and I think it's somewhat reassuring, and I say somewhat because it's not as if fake news has not influenced elections before the social media era. It used to be that the release of a false accusation against someone or a bogus police report or whatever would be a way of sinking someone's candidacy at the last minute, and you didn't need the internet for that. You just had lots of other ways of getting it out. So it's not as if that has stopped happening, and yet studies on both Twitter and Facebook have suggested that fake news, most fake news is circulated by a small sector of users. I am sorry to announce that they are older males. So Ken and I are going to have to do some self-searching about this. And they circulate typically mostly to other people in that same set. They are found satisfying for whatever reason. The evidence that they are changing anyone's votes or even changing anyone's attitudes didn't come through that strongly. And I'll pause at this point to say that I've drawn up a mailing list that was of the articles that I drew on, which we can paste into chat here and will also be made available through FPRI. But so on the one hand, most of the election nonsense, the stuff that was said about Hillary Clinton, for example, it doesn't really seem to be changing the news diet of most of the users of these platforms. They found that users of these platforms continue to get most of their news from the major news organizations rather than from these suspect sources. At the same time, you do find, and again, this is not new with social media, but you find the public extraordinarily misinformed about some questions. You know, is Bill Gates plotting some sort of vaccine attack? There are very disturbing poll results on how miseducated the public is on that. I would only put, again, by way of perspective, that had you polled the public in the pre-internet era, you would have found equally remarkable things, that popular delusions about conspiracy have been widespread for a long time. It didn't take the internet to do them. So the actions of foreign operators on the internet are kind of a case on their own. They are, from the First Amendment standpoint, I worry that they are the thin end of a wedge, because there is the most constitutional excuse for demanding that the government be given a hotline to say, you know, hey, Facebook, take down these accounts, and, you know, Twitter, ban everything that says this. I am not convinced, and there has already been one good question from Robert Friedman in chat. I'm not convinced that the government can very safely be entrusted with this power to make a telephone call to Mark Zuckerberg and say, take down everything that asserts this, or take down all accounts that look like that. In some ways, although I am not a great fan of Zuckerberg, I trust the market forces at play upon him more than I trust whoever is going to be sitting in the White House making that call.
Okay, moving to another topic. There seems to be two models of how to police the web. And the first is the German model. It mandates that the governments will find the intermediary, which is the Twitter or whatever else, that they will be fined for undesirable material. And there's something like, the German model has been followed by some 13 countries, and it's very attractive to authoritarian leaders, obviously. The other model is what I would call the private voluntary model, or a solution offered drawing on citizens, or drawing on members of or users of the internet to keep one another informed as to what's wrong. And I would commend to our listeners, viewers, a couple of articles. In fact, 3 articles, and they're all from the American Interest magazine, and they're all within, except for one that was the Washington Post. But the others were in the American Interest magazine within this time frame, with our current time frame. And 2 of those articles were about citizen action. The most thorough one, the longest one, was done interestingly by a fellow named Thomas Kent. Kent was the head of RFE-RL, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, among other things. And he goes into the ways in which East Europeans have dealt with dubious content. Apparently, this started in earnest. This attention started in earnest at about the time that Russia invaded the Donbass, the Ukraine, and there had been quite a lot of experience in Eastern Europe in dealing with Russian disinformation. And what formed, and he focuses on Lithuania, Slovakia, the Czech Republic, it took the form of the creation of citizen groups that they find each other somehow, and they can be national, they can be international, but what they do is to keep one another informed of what's on the web. And this appears to work fairly well. Another example of this is Taiwan. Taiwan dealing with Chinese disinformation. And by and large, it's this same sort of citizen networking that's employed. But Taiwan also has a digital minister named Audrey Fang. And Audrey coordinates the national response to disinformation. And she's got the timing down on this, down to 2 minutes. So if something pops up that's dubious from Beijing, the ministry is on it and involves, again, all of these private voluntary networks. And this is obviously a very desirable alternative to a memorandum coming out from, say, Twitter, way after the fact, that actions have been taken. At any rate, Kent's article, as I said, focuses on Eastern Europe, and the other article is on Taiwan. It's by Jacob McNagama and Jonas Perello-Plesner. So you ought to look for these, and when we get round to sending out something, I will include these along with Walter's list of articles to pay attention to. The final article is by Robert Samuelson of the Washington Post, and there's one more by Peter Pomerantsev, which also appeared in the American Interest. So we'll get this information out to you. So go ahead, Walter.
And if I could jump in on this contrast between the German model and the American model, because a lot of policy debates do wind up tracking that difference, in part because of our First Amendment, in part because of our different historical development. We do not trust the government to take this central role, which sometimes rationalized as being fact-checking, sometimes rationalized as being the suppression of extreme or hateful opinion. Germany does those things, we do not. And I will throw out a couple of anecdotes, they are only anecdotes, about reasons to be glad we have the American approach, connected with, for example, the ongoing pandemic. A number of the social media platforms hooked their own public pronouncements to what was being said by the Centers for Disease Control and the World Health Organization, so that if you had typed a post about masks, for example, or about means of transmission, they would deck it with some information answering your questions by saying, for example, no, you should not wear masks if you are a civilian who is not sick. And of course, we now know that this information from both the CDC and the World Health Organization was itself erroneous. For whatever reason, and I'm not among those who say that this was deliberately erroneous, I think that it was inadvertently erroneous. But the fact is that getting one answer from everywhere on masks was generally less good for the public than getting a mix of different views on masks, which would, I think, have led people a little more quickly to realize that the opinion prevailing in much of Asia and Central Europe was the right one, and that the US one was the wrong attitude. There's a fascinating article in Commentary magazine, not the current issue, but about one issue ago, on a disaster that's largely been forgotten, the 1964 earthquake in Anchorage, tremendously destructive, causing complete chaos in the city, and the contrast between the local radio station and the official emergency responders who were putting out a line about how residents of Anchorage should respond. Well, the official responders were caught up in a kind of a circle of not wanting to cause public panic. And so they put out quite a bit of either misinformation or half information for fear of sparking public panic. The radio station just sort of called everything as it saw it because news sells. And people wanted their stories told. And no guesses as to which served the public more. The radio station's stream of information, admittedly a different era of media, when media thought of itself differently, but it wound up with much more useful information for the citizens of Anchorage. And if you carry that forward to the present day, I'm working on a piece about how federalism has been vindicated in some ways by the pandemic experience. And one of the odd things that federalism produced in the United States was a multiplicity of public presentations where you could go and watch the White House ones if you wanted. Here in Maryland, you could watch Larry Hogan speak every day or two, or in New York, you could watch Cuomo, or interestingly, you could watch Hogan or Cuomo even if you didn't live in Maryland or New York. And you could bypass, in other words, whichever form of public presentations you thought were not very reliable or not very useful. And that's why, even though I'm dubious about government setting itself up as a speaker, I kind of smile when I hear about experiments like the one in Taiwan that Ken was just explaining, because governments sometimes have access to excellent information. And so long as we have a multiplicity of voices, then we can route to the ones that we find to have been helpful in explaining the situation, rather than just to the one official voice our own government might want us to hear.
Okay, I'm reminded in what you said that there is maybe a third model, or I don't know, I'm not going to count, but another model of proceeding, and that's the one that I call a Swedish model. There is an organization called I Am Here. It's international, and there's a woman named Mina Dennert, Swedish woman, who's in charge. And what I Am Here does is it goes into dubious content and hits the like button, and then engages civilly with whatever has been said, and apparently it's quite a substantial undertaking. But what I've seen is that there is so much attention to this issue that one really can't come to much of a conclusion as to its effectiveness, this civic model, if you want to call it that. And in some of the stuff that Mr. Kent addresses, it's interesting to see where progress has been made. It's generally speaking on limited issues. In the case of Lithuania, it was Nike's promotion of a line of sneakers that had SSS Air, the old Soviet logo, if you want to call it that, on it. And the Lithuanians reacted very strongly to this unwanted memory of its past, of Lithuania's past. And Nike eventually removed the product from the market. What we don't see enough of, it seems to me, is what some of this dubious content is. And I understand that we don't want to rebroadcast every objectionable thing, but you know, somehow someone's got to be able to put his or her hands around this in a useful way, and that's why I think the Taiwan example is particularly useful. There are doubts about whether it's going to continue to work, and there's pressure in Taiwan to take the German model seriously. At any rate, go ahead.
Well, I agree there have been a lot of successful demonstrations of the engage and argue back strategy in the area you mentioned and in a bunch of others. The obvious thing about that is that it's a high resource requirement. You need a bunch of very dedicated volunteers, assuming they're going to be volunteers, or if you turn it over to an organization, before long the organization has its own interests. So where it can be done, and there are issues on which it can be done, it can work very well as an all-purpose antibiotic for wrongness that other people don't care about enough, or where there simply aren't enough volunteers to respond less well. And again, we see in the pandemic that often there is no good solution. Many people will remember a couple of months ago that there was a fairly professionally done video floating around with conspiracy theories about the pandemic and a lot of anti-vaccine and highly erroneous things. Well, what was the best response? For a lot of people, the best response was to get on a soapbox and denounce to all of their friends that there was this video that they must not watch. Now, how well did that work? It's called the Streisand Effect, which is when you warn people against saying something, before long, many more people know about it than before and want to check it out. After when Barbara Streisand tried to prevent overhead photography of her house. And so there is not necessarily a right answer, but what I love about the volunteer civic involvement one is that you do get the pleasant side effects. You get individual people becoming more thoughtful. You get a chance to advance the particular public debate on that one thing. It's not cleaning up everything that's wrong on the internet, nor is it bailing out the ocean with a pail, but it may help the individuals involved see further into the issue. Now, we had a question from Robert Friedman on chat, and again, please do submit your thoughts and your questions on chat. Asking what difference it would make if anonymity were present or absent, if anonymity had to at least be flagged and explained. Now, the real world experiment on anonymity versus its lack, of course, is Facebook versus Twitter. Facebook puts a lot of resources into trying to make sure that it's only real people identifying themselves. It doesn't do it perfectly, but it does pretty well. Twitter does not and invites anonymous accounts. And this experiment, probably you can conclude that Twitter is a little more politically toxic. Either can kill you in the right doses, but Twitter will kill you a little bit faster. But at the same time, again, to go back to my old First Amendment roots, anonymous speech is mostly worthless, but includes some really important hidden gems. It was important in the American Revolution. Anonymous videos are often fakes. At other times, they can be someone putting a video out that they don't dare yet associate with, but that is a real video. So I spent a lot of time on Twitter, even though I know it is both more obnoxious and acrimonious, and there is a higher volume of extremely suspicious anonymous accounts, because Twitter simply gives me certain types of news information that I can't get as easily on Facebook. You may have different preferences. I know an awful lot of people drop off Twitter when they see what it's like and use only Facebook, but be aware that there's trade-off.
Okay, shall we take some more questions? Walter, why don't you take a look at these and see what you'd like to respond to?
Well, we have mostly, there is one objection that I wasn't characterizing the vote by mail thing correctly. I think it's not likely to be of interest to the whole group here to get more deeply into that. And I'll just say, I accept that, not everyone agrees with the way I characterized it. But the, if we don't have more questions at the moment, let me maybe introduce I'm sorry, do we have more questions? Okay. I will try to introduce an angle or two that we had not brought in before. One of them is that the legal background, as I mentioned, was different for speech originating abroad and speech originating with foreign states than for domestic speech. And there is, for example, the FARA, the Foreign Agent Registration Act. So we might want to look at first whether or not a lot of the speech in question could already be dealt with by things like bringing actions for foreign non-registration. But beyond that, does it make sense to look at further legislation? My own suspicion is that people want an international internet. They do not like, at least American users, don't like the idea of content being available in other countries that is not visible to them in the US. They want to see it all, rightly or wrongly. But there's already been quite a bit of experience with the setting up national walls in which something that is visible in the US is not visible in France or Germany. Usually that's the way it works. Usually the US has access to the content. Again, I'm a user. I appreciate having the content there to view, even if it's something horrible like an ISIS video. And ISIS videos are pretty darn awful as far as potential propaganda impact. And yet, when I am researching, as I occasionally do, terrorism issues, it is helpful to know how they talk about their own operations. It helps you rule out certain theories and helps you see patterns to be able to go see their propaganda. The US is liberal on these things. I urge us to consider the benefits we've had from being one of the most liberal countries on things like access to that sort of material.
Okay. I was curious about something that Robert Samuelson wrote a year ago. He came up with, he advocated a more muscular response, whatever that happened to mean. But as it turns out, what he was talking about was a series of 4 suggestions. The first one was that America should build a firewall, like North Carolina. That was one. Another one was shifting cyber traffic that's used for operational purposes. In other words, running power stations or dams or whatever. Switching these to private networks, get them off the web, and essentially turning the web into a non-essential make the web deal only with non-essential communication. The third one was to build redundancy into the system. Okay, I sort of understand that. And the fourth was mandate that the most sophisticated computer chips be made in the United States. These struck me as highly problematic, but what's your reaction to that, Walter?
Well, the idea of, I mean, I'm not sure which one to disagree with first. It's a target-rich environment, but the idea of keeping stuff that is too important off the web, when people go onto the web precisely in hopes of getting alerted early to the things that are most important, it's just a complete non-starter. We are stuck with people wanting to get information this way. We are stuck with the particular tastes of internet users. And one of the issues I touched on, but it's worth emphasizing again, is that if you consult users of all of these platforms, they are not indicating by their choices that they prefer only the factually correct accounts, or that they prefer only the most responsible accounts, whether for entertainment or because they want to argue back or because they want to check what the other side is thinking. People value the ability to go on and find wrong opinion and political views opposed to theirs. It's one of the things a huge number of people, not just a specialized niche, wants out of the internet. It's why those functions are so popular on the internet, and why the profit-making companies that run these things don't want to eliminate public debate, because it draws people in and it gets people clicking and clicking and clicking. And to the extent that there is a fault here, it is in the mirror. We cannot hold a mirror up in Zoom, or else you'll get a very strange picture. But a lot of the problems with the internet and its moderation come from what we all individually seek out and click on as users. Now, the point about different technologies brings me over to a question that we got from Ellen Kupfer in chat here, which is, she says, if younger people are going more to TikTok and Snapchat, is there anyone looking at these platforms? And that is an excellent question. Instagram also. The fact is, I've been talking about Facebook and Twitter, which are the Plato's symposium as far as seriousness and ability to get both sides of the story, compared with TikTok, Instagram, Snapchat, much less verbal, much more transient image oriented, and manipulable in some of the same ways to get some of the same lies across, as it were, but harder to correct than in a Facebook page where someone can chime in saying, here's why that assertion is wrong. Much harder to do that with the newer technologies. I don't have a good answer on that. When in doubt and when lacking other answers, I revert to civic education, which seems like settling for a tie in chess or something. It's so unsatisfying to say, teach people not to assume that every picture is accurate rather than a Photoshop. Teach people that a meme that is set up so that you can't track where it came from or how to reply is probably feeding you something that you shouldn't be swallowing politically. And yet this kind of civic education sometimes seems to me to be the lost hope, especially as we move on to the platforms that Ellen mentioned, where there is so much less chance to talk back.
Okay. I don't know if we have a moderator on at the moment. But I haven't really looked closely at the questions.
No, I've been looking at them. I think we've. This is the time to chime in on chat if you are in the audience. You have our attention, and there is no waiting line of chat questions.
Right. Okay. Just a minor reflection. People don't seem to understand the nature of politics, it seems to me. And when someone like a Joe Biden says that that there is factual, he emphasizes the importance of factual information in politics. Politics is rather more about opinion, I think, and we have become, I think, perfectly dubious about what we hear from political campaigns. And so the idea of policing something or policing politics is, it seems to me to be a very dubious way to go with things, given what we're, as Walter has said, what we're accustomed to as Americans in terms of dealing with information. I have to admit to having been very dismayed about the varieties of views that I was reading and seeing on television, et cetera, about the pandemic. And I start to worry about the question of trust. All political systems are based on trust. And well, when things don't seem trustworthy, then there is indeed chaos, because one can make up one's mind for oneself, of course, and I think most people do just fine with that. But on the other hand, you get these periods of, I suppose it's the confusion over the pandemic is reflects, or it's reflected in this concern about the bad internet. And, perhaps we do worry too much about that sort of thing. And with a pandemic, for example, one simply has to wait until things become clear. Anyway, yeah, Raleigh, go ahead.
Ken, let me ask you a question. You've been studying this topic for a long time, you and Walter both. Is there something about this, it's a complex topic, but is there something about this that either the people who are looking at it or our government policymakers, is there something they're missing? Is there something people should be talking about that they're not talking about?
Walter, I think probably is would do better at handling that. I can think of lots of things, and I can, from day to day, conceive that what's going on is important. At any rate,
I would say it's often not appreciated the extent to which these technologies continue to be moving targets. And prescribing against an ill that we see this year, and that would be doing well because most of us are formulating our ideas based on things we noticed were wrong with the internet 3 or 4 years ago. Whatever recommendations we might lobby for will be imposed on or adopted by a set of social media platforms that will have evolved yet further, because they continue to evolve at really quite an impressive clip. It's not unusual at all for people to be clamoring for something that they have been trying to introduce for several years and haven't been able to get it to work. In other cases, they saw why something wouldn't work. It doesn't mean that all of the evolution is necessarily in a good direction. But a lot of things are old chestnuts. Why doesn't Twitter allow editing of old tweets, for example? You could get rid of so much misinformation if you could only allow people to say, this tweet was erroneous and I've edited it, and then the 100,000 retweets it got would be turned to the good rather than the evil. Well, as Twitter knows, allowing that to happen introduces possibilities for people to play the system in other ways. For example, to tweet out something innocuous, get lots of people to endorse it and then change it to something very evil and bad and leave all those endorsements in place. So it's, nonetheless, they introduce new experiments quite frequently. And I think that anyone out in the group here who is thinking of going into this in a serious way and trying to influence the debate, just try first to catch up with where the technology is and is headed, because you may find it reassuring that they've been trying to solve your problems already, or you may despair that so many of the problems are not easy to solve.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Ken,
any thoughts on that? Or, my own observation, government is remarkably slow and inefficient at dealing with hard issues like this, simply because of the budget process itself, the budget and contracting process. And am I correct in assuming that these are really problems that will be solved by the private sector or some combination of public-private partnership? Is that correct?
Well, that I have a strong doubts about. I've been following this issue since 2012, and almost all of the questions that have been raised in the cybersecurity realm are unresolved. The government-private sector relationship, I remember, was it 2013, Barack Obama asked for a task force to put together recommendations with regard to how the private sector ought to keep the government informed, that the government ought to help the private sector. And what happened was, in 1 year, the report was due in 1 year, and at the end of that year, what came out was a form that was recommended to the private sector to report to the government. That was it. That was a year's worth of work. And there are other examples. About that same time, the government set up 16 key sectors of the private economy that ought to be communicating with government. After a year of that, only 3 of those 16 sectors had taken advantage of the service, and this goes on and on. It's like the encryption versus law enforcement debate. I have to agree with Stuart Baker, our mutual friend. Stuart Baker thinks that the encryption debate will never be over. And in the first meeting of this kind that I did in 2012, I heard from a former Attorney General of the United States who said that when it comes to tech threats or cybersecurity, it's best for the law to get out of the way until the, something reasonable can be imagined. And so I think it goes on, and it's very frustrating.
Yeah.
And I read about legislation all the time. I read this morning, for example, that this Cyberspace Solarium Commission had recommended that a director of cybersecurity be created. And I read this morning that Congress decided it would not address this issue in the in legislation now, but there ought to be more study of how that should be. Well, there's not. I don't think there are a whole range of things that are that can't be responded to, and the threat scenario changes all the time. So,
yeah,
you know.
I think we have time for just one more quick question, and we have one, I think, in the queue. Walter, are you taking a look at that? Do you want to try to?
I see 2 questions here, and one from Ellen Kupfer about how to make civic education happen. Probably takes more time than we've got left in this hour, and one from, I wish it were easy, and one from Cynthia Palmer about is it better to be confident and happy in one's own relationships or contribute and be a global citizen with trust diminishing? 2 big questions, much too little time to answer either of them, but a good note to end on, because if the trust isn't there, social media isn't going to work. But on the other hand, a lot of other things are also going to be failing. And if the trust can be brought back, we will find new ways of making social media work well. I'll throw in one other thought, which is we take so much for granted in the US, just like having the world's standard currency, that we are the home of the leading social media platforms. We mustn't take that for granted. It's a tribute to the fact that we provided a better environment for innovation and for freedom. And it might not be true 10 years from now if we don't continue.
Thank you, Walter, and thank you, Ken. Fascinating discussion, and to those of you in the audience, if this is a topic that interests you, this is the first of 3 in the series. We'll be doing two more events around this topic in the coming next few weeks. They're not yet on our calendar, but they will be soon, and so thank you. Thank you for your support. Check out our website if you'd like to listen to this again, or you missed part of it, or you missed part of our other events. Again, the FPRI YouTube channel has all these videos. And we welcome your feedback. So please let us know what you like, what you didn't like, what you'd like to hear more of. Have a good weekend. Stay safe. All the best to you and your families. Thank you.
One PS.
Yeah.
That's in the beginning to thank FPRI for sponsoring this series.
Yes.
And also to you and to Eli for taking your part in doing this. I have never done this before, and you all have made this a real pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken. Appreciate those kind words. To our audience, have a great weekend. Stay safe. Take care.